Good morning. This is Sarah Raymer Dean, and my business name is Northern Impressions by Sarah, and chanterelles are a part of northern life in the bush. If you like to forage, they're a really good thing to eat and to preserve for the winter. Plus, they're pretty. So the other day, I painted a little sketch. Sketches are a tool that I use just to decide what colors might work for a painting, what paints might work, what layers, what order of layers. Here I took some walnut ink that's water soluble, and I used a pen with the ink to create some really dramatic lines. And, so that's one thing on a sketch. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. It's a learning experience, and you decide whether you enjoy that effect or not. So today, given the experience that I had with creating this little sketch, now I want to create a painting. Here's my paints. When I'm ready to paint after a few days of thinking about something, often I go back in and I add a bit of color, a little bit of water, to my paints, and away I go. That's another reason to love watercolor. You do not have to worry about it drying. You just add a little bit of water and away you go again, no matter how many days later. All right, so the budgies are happy and talking. I guess they have a lot to say. I hope you don't mind. All right, today we're going to start with the lightest coat on the chanterelles. And I might not talk a lot because I'm tired and a bit sick. But being tired and sick doesn't mean you stop working when you work for yourself. So away we go with the light yellow. And this is Hansa. Let me think. I think it's Hansa Yellow Deep by M. Graham. That's also what happens when you wait a few days. You forget what exactly. And I'm using a Velvet Touch long round brush. And I like these because they have sharp points and they're springy. Technically, they're a multimedia brush, but that doesn't matter. If you find a brush that holds a moderate amount of water and does the things you want it to do, that's fine. It doesn't have to be a watercolor brush. Right now I'm taking off a little bit of color because I thought it was a little bit too much. So I dampened my brush and then I just rubbed the area and I dabbed it on my shop towels. Then the challenge is to not get your hands in your paint that you've already painted. So I do like a light piece of foam board. It's a little bit rigid, but very light. So that helps when you tape down your painting paper to something like that. It makes it less difficult to move around because it helps to be able to move your painting as you go. You'll notice that I taped down my painting with masking tape, and this is something you should not do unless you have a heat source to remove it with. So yeah, you need to use a hair dryer or a heat tool before you try to remove this. Okay, we had a little break and now we're back. So the little leaves that I've got going here for the blueberries, a slight undercoating of yellow can be beneficial to make the greens look nice. And so there, a little coat, a light coat of yellow will help add some vibrancy. So every time you paint a new area, you try not to get your hand in it, obviously, but you have to let that dry in order to glaze another color on top. You can't glaze unless the paint underneath is totally dry. So because of that, I think we'll go on to painting the blueberries. And where the blueberries touch the leaves, then I have to be very careful because the paint could bleed into the leaves. So at this point, I get another smaller brush. It helps if you don't drop them. And I'm going to pick up some of this Szmal Cobalt blue. This is a slightly opaque granulating blue. It has a slight green bias, or so it seems to me. So when you have a granulating paint, it often lifts easier than others, making glazing a bit difficult. But the goal with it is to lay it down and let it create texture without messing with it too much. However, I realized that I had a little bit too dark, so that's why I went in and I lifted some of that paint. So now going back in for a bit more. And the initial wash that you layer on your object should be the lightest color present, except for white areas that you don't paint at all. It's okay to touch your wash while it's wet and then just charge in. That's what you call it when you take a bit of a darker paint and you touch. What you're doing is you're letting that paint just kind of go in there, darken the area, and create a bit more texture. Oops, getting a little messy here. So I have the reference image up on the screen for you because my pet peeve is when I watch somebody on YouTube, I like to see what they're painting from. But you'll see that I have loosely adapted my painting to that photo. It's not exact. And that's what you should do too. You should use a reference photo for accuracy. But you can change it up. You don't have to be a slave to it, that's for sure. I mean, you know, these are my goals because I like to be realistic to a large extent. Everybody has different goals and aims with their paintings. So that's the first layer on those blueberries, and I think they look kind of cute. That's Cobalt Deep, or is it just Cobalt Blue? But it's an odd pigment. It's a PB72. So that stands for Pigment Blue 72, which is how people identify pigments. And it's a really interesting pigment because usually cobalt is a PB28, sometimes PB50. But yeah, it's just an interesting color, and I really liked it. So I bought it in this half pan from Roman Szmal, who's a maker of paints from Poland. And he has some really unique pigments, but the paints only come in half pans, so that's why I buy them that way. I do prefer them from a tube so I can just squeeze them onto a palette and work with them that way. But half pans have their uses too. All right, so now maybe we could look at that moss. It's a light green, and I've got this kind of a minty green here. It's from Winsor Newton, and it's called Winsor Green Yellow Shade. So for doing something like a moss, I use a liner, sometimes called a rigger. So this liner brush is, you know, like all of my paintbrushes, synthetic. It's from Simply Simmons, and it's a 10/0. So it's a fine type of brush, which is good when you're working with something like this moss, which just is like little filaments. So one of the things about working with filaments or like hairs, fur, is the direction of the stroke that you use matters. For instance, here I'm starting at the stem and pulling out, and the reason for that is that the stroke is wider when you first touch down, and as you lift and pull away, it lightens. So that works better. If you tried to start out here and pull in, your line would be too fat, which is one of the reasons it's good to twirl your actual painting. So that you can easily do what works best for your hands, because I can only move my hands in certain directions very effectively. Okay, so, you know, we're getting the idea of a wispy little piece of moss. But there's a rusty color in there too. And so while it's still damp, you can go in with, you know, a rust color, and hopefully there's enough paint there, it'll kind of bleed and blend a little. And if not, you can add a little water and just sort of blend that. And this is a little root system here on that piece of moss that got pulled up when I was trying to get the mushroom, and I didn't have a very good knife. So I'll repeat the fact that this mushroom, which I said when I was sketching it, has a root end on it, is not representative of what I would normally do. Normally I would have a sharp knife and I would cut that so that the roots would stay in the ground. But that day I didn't have a very good knife. And that's what happened. The root pulled up. You can see these are cut as they should have been. Okay, well, there, my moss is starting to look like a piece of moss, isn't it? Now, the chanterelles are dry. If you doubt, you're not sure, you can just lightly touch the surface with a finger just to see. So we first layered with a lighter yellow. Now we're going to go in with a darker yellow. And that yellow is PY, so Pigment Yellow 110. And this is Indian Yellow made by M. So this area underneath the cap is darker, and I'm just going to go in there. And having wetted that, I'm going to just kind of drag this down a little bit. Leaving some areas light yellow because that's how it is. And under here we've got a shadow. It kind of goes like that. Sometimes the edges of the stalk look darker because of the way they're bending. Now, while this is wet, we can go get a darker color and charge that in, meaning we're just adding to the paint and we're going to allow that paint to mix. So notice that I painted a shadow. The shadow was not as light as the Indian yellow. So now I've gone back in and quickly darkened that. And here I can go in and touch with this Quinacridone, which is PO 48 from M. Again, most of the colors I use are single pigment, and that's what I like because when you glaze and when you mix, you get prettier glazes and mixes. Here we're mixing on the paper because it makes the process take less time. Plus, it's kind of cool. It looks kind of neat when they blend on the paper. So I'm going to just kind of try to show the 3 dimensions of this by doing a bit of shading. All right, now we're going to go on to this mushroom. So looking at the photo, I see some kind of really dark down here. So I'm putting Quinacridone right there, right along the edge too, because as the mushroom's been cut, it begins to dry. and darken as it dries. So with this one, I'm just kind of going in and putting in some darker color without doing the Indian yellow first. And now I'm going to go in with the Indian yellow. And I try to paint in the direction that the plant grows. Now I'm going back in there with that Quin Rust. Back to this chanterelle because, you know, as I see it start to dry, I see, oh yeah, well, it could be darker. Because as watercolor dries, it lightens, but it's still wet, so that allows the colors to blend a little better. All right, now, this cap. In some areas it's really light, in others it's not so much, so we'll go and try to paint that. So I'm back. I now need to paint this chanterelle. So let's see here. Well, again, we have a very dark area right here, and I'm going to turn the painting so my hand doesn't stay in that wet area. And I think even though this area is light, it's still darker than the lemon yellow. And now this area could use some warmth, so I'm going to paint this warmer Indian yellow there. And you can tell it's a fairly thin wash. So you just keep looking at your photo, finding the areas of light and shadow. If you get something on that you don't like, just give it a rub with a paper towel lightly. Okay, I'm gonna go get some Quinacridone rust again, and I'm going to touch around here. Now you can see it feathering and bleeding into areas, and sometimes that's okay. Okay, then under here we have a more pronounced shadow. I spend a lot of time just looking and thinking as I go. So you look at the shadow and you try to decide if it's kind of an abrupt shadow or if the edge is soft. And now I'm rummaging around through my paint palettes off screen, kind of looking for some black to mix with some Quinacridone over here. And the reason that I like this black, which usually one doesn't use black if you know kind of a bit about color mixing, is that I like it because it granulates. It's called Lunar Black from Daniel Smith. And when you're painting organic shapes, I think that the granulation helps lend credibility to those shapes, because yeah, rarely are things like absolutely perfectly shaded. They have some variation in them. So now that I kind of did my pattern, I'm just kind of touching in there, leaving a few white light areas, and you see I added to that shadow. And if I mess something up, oh well, go back with a dampish brush and lift a bit. Okay. Yeah, I guess I would like things to be perfect, but that's not life. Besides, it's a painting. All right, I'm beginning to see some texture in here. I don't know if you can see that, but I like that. And now I'm thinking, I don't really like this edge. So I'm going to go in with my damp but not wet brush and give that a little rub. Okay, so you can see the granulation beginning to happen in here. And that's good because this is organic. It's got some texture to it. Now I'm going to go in and add a bit of dark in here underneath this cap because the shadow is pretty pronounced. And it's not really just black, it's black mixed with the quinacridone rust. So where the stalk comes into the cap, you want to highlight the shadow around there to show that shape. And the shadow here. So these gills on a chanterelle fork multiple times in their journey from the cap to the stalk. They go about, I don't know, well, they go a ways down the stalk, and that's one of the identifying features of a chanterelle. Because yes, they're gilled, but they are not like most gilled mushrooms. They're not very deep, a bit shallow, and forking multiple times. So very interesting to me anyway. Now here, so I am working on paint that is not completely and utterly dry. So you get used to your paint, your paper, and so on to see what kind of things it can tolerate. So did I call this Mars Black? It's from Daniel Smith, and it's actually called Lunar Black. But, you know, a lot of different paint companies name their paints different names. So Mars Black is a name that often applies to this pigment of PBK